This week on Office Hours, we're at the Chicago Field Museum. I'm here with Corrie Moreau in the Chicago Field Museum. So it seems like, based on your background and your work with the University of Chicago, you'd be really at home in a research lab at a big university. What drew you to working in a museum?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'm still in a big research lab, just inside of a natural history collection. When I was finishing graduate school, I was looking at jobs that were available, and this job came up, and it's a kind of a dream because everything I do is specimen-based. So even though I do a DNA and genomics, the material that I work from are the kinds of things that we put into museum collections. So for me, since I'm interested in biodiversity, what better place to be able to see diversity than in a natural history museum collection?
Have you seen anything with like climate change, and has that affected the success of ant populations in the wild?
Absolutely. I mean, so there's a couple things there, one of which that invasive species are hugely problematic, right? So those are species that humans inadvertently sort of move around the globe. And in the case of ants, some of the world's worst offenders in the case of invasive species belong to ants. So any of you who've spent time in southern US probably have encountered fire ants or Argentine ants. There's a plethora of them that have invaded. And when those species are introduced, unfortunately, they often disrupt the local ecosystems and the local species. Now, in some cases, we can't tease apart whether it's the human disturbance or the invasive species. But in some species, we know that they can even invade pristine habitats, right? So things like rainforests that have no human sort of impact. And what we see there is that they actually are essentially disrupting the local communities, and in many cases driving the local species to either low population levels or at least, and maybe even to extinction. The other side of that has to do with climate change, right? So interestingly, you asked about, what's it like to work in a natural history museum? So clearly I have access to all of these specimens that have been here since, well before I arrived, for 100 years. So what we did is we actually went in and databased all of the information about where those ants are recorded from all over the planet. And then, with a former research technician of mine, we went in and mapped all of the species that are found in what we're calling the Nearctic region. So all of the species in Canada, the US, and Mexico. And we use those data to inform us about which climatic variables best explain where you would find ants. And maybe not surprising, it's exactly what you'd predict. Things like temperature, mean coldest temperature of a month, and precipitation. So we know that insects are very susceptible to things like being very cold and being very wet. And when we do that, we can then say, all right, how good are these data explaining the remaining parts of our data? And once we felt confident that the models were explaining our data well, we then said, all right, if we use some of these conservative models of future climate change scenarios, what do we see? And when we do that, what we see is that the prediction is that ants will have a very significant northward shift in their distributions. By the year 2050, probably 500 miles more northward. Now, that might sound, well, great, now ants have bigger ranges to live in. But what we know is that most species can't keep up with that rate of change. Most species don't have the ability to migrate or disperse those ranges. So what we're going to see is a lot of extinctions happening. In addition, the species that are going to be highly successful at making those big jumps are all those invasive species. And so that has big implications both for the local ecosystems and all of the organisms they interact with, but also has implications for human health and for things like food security. For human health, we know that many of those species are the things we get bitten, stung by, right? And in the case of food security, most of these insects also harbor pests that are terrible for crops. So they might tend to aphids, right, that are really terrible for crops. And so we can expect to see an increase in these species that are going to be detrimental to humans.
It's really easy to think about how it affects humans in maybe a positive way, that, hey, you don't have to deal with this species in this area anymore because of certain extinctions. But ants are really important in the ecosystem. What role do they play, and what are we going to be missing out on if we see mass extinctions of species of ants in the very near future?
Ants are one of those species that I would argue are critical to almost every environment. They're ecosystem engineers, right? So one of the things is, if you've ever seen an ant climbing down into the ground, what they're essentially doing is building their nest. But as they do that, they're responsible for aerating soil and for turning soil and bringing nutrients down into the soil. And so some people have speculated that ants might be more important to soil health and the health of the plants that live in soil than even earthworms. And so really they're providing a very fundamental role there. In addition, they're the world's scavengers, right? They're picking up all of the dead things that are happening around the globe. And so if we don't have them cleaning up, then essentially you're going to have sort of a buildup of all the things that would typically be taken care of by them. We also know that they're responsible for things like dispersing seeds. And so many kinds of plants rely on ants to disperse their seeds. And if ants aren't there, then essentially you're going to have a huge impact on the native plant community.
So then why do we kind of think of ants as just agricultural pests and we don't tend to appreciate them? Are there negative sides to having a lot of species of ants, or do we really only see that with invasive species?
I would argue there's never a situation in which it's bad to have lots of species of ants. I might be biased, but no, I would say that as long as they're part of the local community, there's a reason for them to be there, right? So they're interacting with that environment in some important way. And in the case of invasive species, yeah, clearly that's not ideal and they can have negative impacts, but ultimately I would say that the only time that ants become pests is when humans are involved, right? And so we may not like them being there, but if they, in many cases, have been there for tens of millions of years longer than we have. So is it our place to sort of say they shouldn't be there, or maybe we should just learn to coexist with them?
Amen. All right, well, thank you, Corrie, for taking time out of your busy schedule to see me here in Chicago. It's been an absolute pleasure.
It's been great to host you, Tori.
Thank you.
Tori and Corrie.
Yeah.